with to think about, how far we've fallen as a society. I mean, maybe I can offer a little bit as to a thought as to, what has led us here. So the focus of what I'm going to talk about today is censorship. But one thing I wanted to also mention, though, is that I want to echo something that Dr. Scott Atlas mentioned earlier, which was simply at the very beginning of his talk, he said, we need to support the young people, like Arthur, like Chris, who's organizing, who, I guess came up with the idea of the symposium. This is, this is where the future is. So here we go. We're going to start with the First Amendment, okay? The First Amendment reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress or grievances. So the First Amendment emerged in the aftermath of the American Revolution, when the framers of the Constitution sought to establish a constitutional order that would guard against the oppressive rule that they have actually fought against. The framers understood that broad free speech rights meant that untruth would circulate along with truth, but they recognized that this was a small price to pay in fostering a vibrant and free society, and that the benefits of protecting all speech, even that which was false or offensive, outweighed the risk of stifling ideas. To this day, there's nothing like the First Amendment anywhere else in the world, at least that I'm aware of. Take the European Convention on Human Rights, for instance. It states, everyone has the right to freedom of expression, but it also states, exercise of these freedoms, since it carries with it duties and responsibilities, may be subject to such formalities, conditions, restrictions, or penalties that are prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society in the interests of national security, for the protection of health or morals, and so on. So what is the free speech? So what is free speech with restrictions? What is it exactly, right? It's censorship. Any restriction of free speech is censorship, and we have to face that. The word censor derives from the Latin word for the judges in ancient Rome who supervised public morality. And that is really the crux of it. It's almost always the issue of morality or power, when someone gives themselves the right to determine what else someone else can or cannot say. Without digressing too much into the legal minutiae, which some here know a lot better than I do, the essence of free speech in the United States is that you can say whatever you want, short of shouting fire in a crowded theater and causing panic. The exact words once used by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in the Schenck v. United States in 1919 were, the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. The second part in this quote is often the one that's overlooked, causing a panic. Thus, saying things which turn out not to be true is okay, unless the effects are so immediate as to cause a panic. Applying this principle to COVID public health measures, it's difficult to see what one could say that would be so immediate as to cause a panic. Saying something on Facebook is not capable of causing a panic. The immediacy of the crowded cinema is missing. There's time to reflect, read, make informed choices. In other words, whatever people say about things like masks or vaccines cannot be in breach of the First Amendment. And yet all of that went completely out the window when COVID arrived. Why? In my view, the origin of this systematic government censorship came earlier. Those efforts began back in 2017, driven in large part by a dislike of a certain President Donald Trump among the ruling elites. In that sense, the beginnings of the government's censorship efforts are really rooted in efforts to silence Trump and the MAGA movement. There are many examples of this that have been documented by Twitter Files journalist Matt Taibbi over the past few months, since Elon Musk opened up Twitter's internal emails over the late last year. As we'll see, understanding pre-COVID censorship efforts is incredibly important for understanding COVID censorship. They are directly connected. I'll discuss two examples. First, there was this systematic effort to silence Trump supporters that started in 2017. And this was driven by, you could call it quasi-government forces. Under this effort, entire censorship lists were drawn up to have people thrown off Twitter under the pretense that they were Russian disinformation agents, when in actual fact, the people that were targeted were almost exclusively ordinary Americans who were simply sharing their views about this or that, usually people on Trump's side of the political spectrum. One of the censorship projects was called Hamilton 68. It's good to remember this if you're not familiar with it. Its purpose was to supposedly track Russian propaganda efforts on Twitter. It was created in 2017 under the auspices of the German Marshall Fund. And I just might add that the German Marshall Fund has done great research that I've actually relied on in the past. So this was kind of shocking to me. This is a group that was set up by the German government as a thank you to America for the original post-World War II Marshall Plan. So in a nutshell, it was the German government's initiative to foster better relations with America that was somehow turned into an initiative to censor Americans. Twitter Files author Matt Taibbi found that Hamilton 68 had flagged 644 so-called Russian propaganda accounts for removal by Twitter. But when Matt looked at the list of names Hamilton 68 actually offered, he found that almost every single one of these accounts belonged to normal Americans. People like editor-in-chief of Consortium News, Joe Laria, or podcast host, Dennis Michael Lynch. Hamilton 68 took real opinions of real Americans and falsely declared those opinions as part of a Russian disinformation operation. Twitter very quickly realized that the purpose of the effort wasn't to silence Russian disinformation, but to silence Trump supporters. In fact, Twitter's head of safety, Yoel Roth, emailed colleagues to say, real people need to know that they've been unilaterally labeled as Russian stooges without evidence or recourse. It's a major problem. This is, Twitter's internal discourse here. But Roth didn't actually win the argument. He was overruled by Twitter's director of communications, Emily Horn, who pushed back by saying that Twitter needed to be careful in pushing back against powerful DC interests. Twitter then went ahead and restricted the flagged accounts, even though they knew that the Russian disinformation claims were false. That is how pernicious these censorship efforts were. The fact is that there was always this cloud hanging over Twitter, and frankly, any other company like it, that if they don't do as they are told, there may be unwelcome repercussions coming out of Washington, D.C. So in this vein, the Twitter Files also revealed that the FBI had played a big role in pushing social media companies to censor speech, from weekly meetings to directly asking for account takedowns. Social media companies even had to set up hidden web portals where FBI staff could flag accounts for takedown. Why did social media companies go along with this? Part of it, I'm sure, has to do with ideology. This is something we've been talking about today already. And of course, this deep dislike of Trump. There's also a lot of evidence that the Twitter Files, that Twitter executives were looking at, they were very concerned about being regulated. Essentially, this was something they were keeping a very, very close eye on. In short, this threat of retaliation from Washington, D.C. strongly influenced Twitter's interactions with government actors. So let me jump to the second example now. Now, this is from 2021. The Department of Homeland Security approached social media companies, in their own words, to, quote, operationalize public-private partnerships between DHS and the social media companies. This proposed public-private partnership was about policing, quote, misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, which in government lingo is referred to as MDM. The hook used by the Department of Homeland Security was that something needed to be done about MDM because it threatened Homeland Security. This takes us right back to the slippery slope embodied in the European model of free speech that I talked about earlier, whereby restrictions are allowed where national security, public safety, or so on are threatened. The second example also illustrates the escalation. In 2017, it was merely Russian disinformation that was supposedly giving rise to free speech restrictions. But by 2021, it was Homeland Security in general. And this takes us right back to COVID. While these censorship efforts preceded COVID, they were certainly spooled up to an industrial scale during COVID. The justifications for free speech restrictions became all of the above: Russian disinformation, foreign actors, Homeland Security, public safety, public health, and so on. And because the virus threat was more tangible than, say, a Russian blogger, few people asked questions. While Twitter's Yoel Roth was reluctant to shut down accounts on the basis of Russian disinformation narratives, those kinds of hurdles were no longer a problem once COVID arrived. It was in the name of COVID that anything went. Anything was possible, no questions asked. In fact, in some cases, the government didn't even have to ask. For instance, it wasn't Anthony Fauci that reached out to Facebook. It was Facebook that reached out to Fauci. On March 15th, 2020, one day before 15 days to slow the spread was announced, Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg emailed Fauci to propose a collaboration between Fauci and Facebook on putting out what Zuckerberg called, quote, authoritative information from reliable sources. Fauci responded favorably, and so Facebook's COVID censorship regime in coordination with Fauci was born. That regime entailed, quote, not allowing false claims about the vaccines or vaccination programs, which public health experts have advised us could lead to COVID-19 vaccine rejection. And it wasn't just vaccines. Posts about hydroxychloroquine were also censored by Facebook, not because it was best practice, but because there was a government line supported by Fauci. The same happened with ivermectin. Recall that getting the mRNA vaccines approved in fast-track mode was only legally possible if there were no other treatments available. It is no wonder, then, that government actors such as Fauci and social media giants such as Facebook made sure that even talking about alternative treatments was effectively forbidden. The censorship regime grew so quickly and so wide that preeminent epidemiologists such as Jay Bhattacharya here and Scott Atlas, who was here earlier, were not only silenced for their views, but called fringe epidemiologists, and by the head of the National Institutes of Health, no less. What was it that Bhattacharya said that got him and his colleagues that label? Well, we've heard about it today a little bit. It was, of course, the Great Barrington Declaration. But still to this day, not a lot of people realize that the Great Barrington Declaration was just merely stating mainstream epidemiological doctrine. There was nothing fringe about it whatsoever at all. The label worked, and Bhattacharya and his colleagues Martin Kulldorff and Sunetra Gupta were ostracized from the scientific community and by the media. Ironically, as we all know, the Great Barrington Declaration is now widely accepted, or perhaps on its way to being widely accepted, as the common sense approach to COVID. But when it mattered, the government, the media, and social media censored any mention of it. We at Epoch Times strongly rejected this and went in the other direction. We were among the first to give these alternative voices a platform to be heard. And we've had some experience from this, and now this takes us back to the first example, because we covered this Russia collusion saga, where we were among the first media outlets to publish the real facts and not the Washington, D.C. narrative. I have a front page of a newspaper that we published 5 years ago, almost to the day, that essentially outlines some of the key findings of this Durham report, which was just published earlier this week. So we also published a documentary on the origin of COVID that was first broadcast on April 7th of 2020. Some of you may have seen it. And this was just as Dr. Fauci was starting to push his natural origins narrative. So I just rewatched it, and looking back, we got almost everything right about the Wuhan lab. And the reason for this, I just might add, is it wasn't rocket science. Okay, you just had to be curious about reality. In fact, 2 days after we first broadcast the documentary, the director of Anthony Fauci's stateside lab at Galveston, a man named James Leduc, who also had happened to have personally trained Wuhan lab staff, started privately discussing our documentary with his colleagues. They were all very much aware that the pandemic likely started in a lab. So while we were being chastised as a conspiracy theory outlet, the people at the center of the affair were privately discussing that Epoch was putting out the facts. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It took years of FOIA litigation to obtain the emails of these public health officials, which is how we know that their private views differed quite significantly from their public views. And sadly, this was also the time that we were demonetized by YouTube. This is another indicator of this kind of huge toolkit that exists for censorship. Just to mention with YouTube, right, I can tell you that we sometimes used YouTube channels as a way to upload, as a place we could upload certain types of videos to kind of review with other contributors to the videos, unlisted videos, ones that weren't public. But if they actually had mention, say, of things like vaccines or masks or the Great Barrington Declaration, YouTube would just take these down. These are not public videos. I think this was actually kind of an algorithmic response, but not actual people going in and looking in our private videos. But it also highlights the pernicious impact of technology and how it can and was used. This brings me back to the First Amendment. 100 years of American jurisprudence has maintained that in a free society, free speech must be free, even if it is untruthful. As recently as 2012, Justice Anthony Kennedy in United States v. Alvarez affirmed that, quote, "The remedy for speech that is false is speech that is true. This is the ordinary course of a free society. The response to unreasoned is the rational, to the uninformed, the enlightened, to the straight out lie, the simple truth." If the Great Barrington Declaration was unreasoned and uninformed, well, then free speech would have exposed its defects, except that there were no defects, which is why it had to be aggressively suppressed instead. And this is the lesson here. Speech is not suppressed because it's wrong. It's suppressed because it interferes with someone's agenda. So what was the agenda, and why did the government, the media, and social media rally around this one agenda rather than let alternative voices on COVID be heard? There are many factors, of course. Let's take Fauci, for instance. He had many reasons to push a false narrative on COVID. For one thing, he knew there was a strong likelihood that his funding of the Wuhan Institute of Virology had something to do with the pandemic in the first place. But he also had other reasons too. Fauci's entire career had been centered on discovering universal vaccines. This is why he was pushing kind of gain-of-function genetic manipulation experiments. COVID was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to fast-track an entirely new genre of vaccines and to do so on a global scale, correctly pointing out that COVID was not particularly dangerous for large swaths of the population, or highlighting the existence of alternative remedies, stood in the way of Fauci's universal vaccine ambitions. But that's just Fauci. Why did everyone else jump on the bandwagon, casting aside 100 years of not only medical science, but also of hard-earned civil liberties? I think the answer to that, to discover it, we have to go back to Trump. When I talked about the beginnings of the government's censorship regime, I did not only do so for historical context, but to also show how Trump, and specifically this deep dislike of Trump among the Washington, D.C. Beltway crowd, drove these efforts. And I think it was the same motivation that drove many of the COVID censorship efforts. That's not to say that there would have been no COVID censorship without Trump, but dislike of Trump was certainly the glue that allowed these various forces to coalesce. When Trump said the virus came out of the Wuhan lab, there was an instant push towards the opposite narrative. When Trump said to try hydroxychloroquine, there was an instant push to outlaw its off-label use. When Trump said to reopen the economy, the entire media complex aggressively pushed against that. I think you get the point. Again and again, the forces of censorship were united by their dislike of Trump. But how do we stop something like this from happening again? So one of the things that the pandemic starkly exposed, and we've been discussing this in various ways already in the panels earlier, is that there's a mechanism in our society that can manufacture perceived consensus, even when nothing near such a consensus exists in different areas. And it also exposed that as human beings, many of us are susceptible to being influenced by that perceived consensus. Journalists, scientists, government leaders, bureaucrats, lay people alike. we're all susceptible somewhat, or many of us are susceptible to this megaphone, as I like to call it. The megaphone can influence us to dislike Trump, or dislike him more, or dislike the person with the power, or dislike the person that the powers that be will anoint as the next Trump. It can influence us to be suspicious of, or even to demonize so-called fringe epidemiologists or the unvaccinated. It generates in us emotions that can become deeply entrenched. So what can we do? Well, we can set up parallel truth-seeking organizations like the Chicago Thinker, the Epoch Times, and G. Bhattacharya and Scott Atlas are involved in the Academy of Science and Freedom on the academic side of things, truth-seeking and science. We have this academic sanity consortium, which I've just learned about recently here. Of course, Scott Atlas' Global Liberty Institute. These are very, very good efforts, I think. But I would argue that it's the censorship that really emerged, the censorship regime that emerged in 2017, that has particularly supercharged the megaphone, or this ability to manufacture perceived consensus in society. The only immediate path that I see, and I'd love to hear from the legal minds in the room on this, but the only path I really see is the legal path. Now's the time to set clear boundaries in stone, preferably by the Supreme Court. That is why the case brought against the government by Missouri and Louisiana is so important. That's Missouri v. Biden, for those that aren't familiar. The case seeks a declaration that the government cannot get involved in policing speech. The declaration would block all federal government officials from collaborating, coercing, colluding with media or social media companies to interfere with First Amendment rights. Although Missouri and Louisiana have won a string of victories, and we've actually learned a lot through the discovery processes of this case, it will likely end up in the Supreme Court, and this is something we should all welcome. A strong declaration from the Supreme Court that these public-private censorship efforts we saw during COVID are unlawful is probably the best thing we can immediately use to ensure a right now to prevent future abuses of the First Amendment. Thank you very much.
Excuse me. Yeah, so that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Jan, for your remarks. That was stellar. We're now going to continue with our third and final panel. This panel is titled The Path Towards Safeguarding Academia. This is going to be a proactive panel where we're going to strategize on what we can do to preserve free speech, academic freedom, and open inquiry in American universities. Our panel is going to be moderated by Jonathan Turley. He's a nationally recognized legal scholar who has written extensively in areas ranging from constitutional law to legal theory to tort law. After a stint at Tulane Law School, Professor Turley joined the George Washington Law faculty in 1990, and in 1998 became the youngest chaired professor in the school's history. He has served as a consultant on Homeland Security and constitutional issues and is a frequent witness before the House and Senate. Professor Turley has served as counsel in a variety of national security and terrorism cases and has been ranked as one of the top 10 lawyers handling military cases. He's also a nationally recognized legal commentator. He ranked 38th in the top 100 most cited public intellectuals in a recent study by Judge Richard Posner and was found to be the second most cited law professor in the country. He also happens to be an alumnus of the college. Without further ado, please welcome Professor Jonathan Turley.
Thank you, Chris. I'm not sure if the panelists want to come up or not. I was told to give a few remarks before the panel. It's a great pleasure to be here and to return to University of Chicago. And as usual, I've learned a lot just being here in a short time. I learned from Arthur Long that we have a football team. That came as a considerable shock. I remember we used to always talk about how Robert Hutchins banned all sports on campus for decades after he was asked by a reporter how he felt about our winning the college football championship, and he responded by banning all organized sports. But it's also good to see that not much has changed. When I was looking at colleges, I was trying to make decisions between Harvard and this place. And I remember my counselor said, there's not an issue. You've got to go to Chicago. And I said, why? And he says, because that's the place set aside for socially dysfunctional nerds like yourself. And looking around this room, not much has changed, with the exception of Arthur Long, who I assume was admitted by mistake. It's a great pleasure to be here. First of all, because I'm enormously proud of this place. I'm proud that it's the #1 ranked free speech university in the country. I'm proud that it has kept that tradition. When I was at University of Chicago as an undergrad, I loved this place. It was exciting to see so many different views, people I disagreed with, people I thought were insane. I grew up in Chicago. I had never actually spoken to a Republican. We were told they existed. And on a couple occasions, I think my mother pointed out to one or two at a safe distance. But when I came here, it was an awakening of different ideas. I hope that's still the case. This is, after all, where the Calvin Report originated and transformed American education. I'm actually finishing up a book, at least that's what I'm telling my editors at Simon & Schuster, on free speech. And it looks specifically at our history of free speech in dealing with periods of rage. It tries to look at why we have, in my view, the most dangerous anti-free speech movement in the history of the country, and what is driving this. Why we have this problem in academia, in the media, every area that I work in. I work in the media, I work in academia, and we're losing ground by the day. And the question is why? Now, part of it, I believe, is because we have had, since the foundation of this republic, which is what my book addresses, this fight as to what is free speech. We've never resolved it. The First Amendment, as was discussed, was unique. It actually departed from our history with Great Britain, but we quickly lost that in what I call the functionalist approach of free speech. And that includes a hold on the Supreme Court. And we see that the plague of functionalism has taken hold, including academia, where many academics, by defining free speech in a very narrow way, constantly allow a series of trade-offs with free speech that free speech almost always loses. In fact, we have a number of academics who believe that free speech is not the basis of academic freedom. Because as academics we're supposed to teach the truth, we actually should avoid people who are saying things that are untrue. That's the whole mystique now, the whole premise of the anti-free speech movement. But in the end, it's not just that intellectual divide. It's about rage. You know, years ago, I referred to this as the age of rage, which sort of was picked up in the media. But and that's actually part of it's the subtitle of my book. There's a strange thing about rage. We've had periods of rage before. This country was born in rage. That's what the Boston Tea Party was. It was rage. We've always had a hard time dealing with rage. It's a sort of a strange category of speech. But there's something about rage that we've learned in academia and we've learned in the media. Rage is addictive. People like it. They don't want to admit it, but they like it. It's a license. It allows you to say things, do things that you would never do otherwise. It's like anonymity in some ways. But rage is a release. And what we've seen in academia is the release of rage. It is the license of rage. So the question is, how do we deal with it? And that's the reason it's such a great pleasure to be here and to talk to people on the panel, which I'm going to ask to come forward. And I will mention that I think everyone knows, I hope, the members of this panel. We're short one, but we have Professor Shapiro from the Manhattan Institute, Professor Graujo from Texas, the La Quinta Sentinel professor, Professor Zedwicki, who is the most redundant academic I know because he's the George Mason University professor at George Mason University, which reminds me sort of like major from Catch 21. If you don't mind, I'm going to refer to everyone by their first names. They can further identify themselves, but I think that everyone is eager to hear from you all.
There we go. You misidentified me in that I'm Professor Emeritus from Georgetown.
Yes, I was going to certainly talk about that. And of course, that was Georgetown's great loss. And we'll talk about that as well. We have actually not even discussed how we were going to do this. And so I'm just going to spontaneously ask each of you to speak for a few minutes and we'll give some of your views and we'll open up. Maybe I'll give a couple of questions and then we'll open it up hopefully to the audience. I'm going to start alphabetically because I'm lazy and that seems the most logical. So Carlos, do you want to just give us some thoughts?
Thank you. Hello? Oh, there you go. First, let me apologize to Christopher because I've been exchanging emails with him and I did not read carefully enough. So I'm completely underdressed and not, so I really apologize for that. I'm a statistician.
That's because you're not a lawyer. You're not.
And that's what I was going to say. I'm also sitting with 3 lawyers here, which is also very uncomfortable. Give a background a little bit of myself before we move forward here. I'm a statistician by training. I was a professor here at the University of Chicago. Was colleagues with John Burge a few years back. I moved to the University of Texas in the past 14 years. And I'm in the business school of the University of Texas. I do a lot of work in machine learning. I'm a technical guy in my daily job. A few years back, I started noticing that the monoculture of universities were bothering me. Especially coming from this place. I had a history of being attached to the Chicago school ideas of economics. And our students were clearly very skeptical of markets and capitalism and the roles of business in society and so on. And so I started looking more carefully around after, getting to be full professor or whatever, and figured that I'm going to try to do something to reform, to create a new avenue of ideas in here. And I created a center that is known to be the only free market center at the University of Texas right now, called the Censorship Center for Policy. The reason I'm telling this is because I'm going to get to the reform beat in a second here. And a few years back, after that, as that grew, we were able to work with the government of Texas to try the creation of this thing that we called at the time the Liberty Institute. And it was something that had a lot of inspiration from the Hoover Institution, from Hillsdale College, from other places where we saw ideas represented that they were not represented at UT Austin. We got funded, we got ready to implement this, and then of course the university fought it to a point where I didn't get fired because I'm a tenured professor, but because I decided to fight for the principle of it. So that was after COVID. So in the beginning of COVID, while still working on some of these projects, I got tasked to help advise the city of Austin and Travis County, the county we sit in, to talk about as the trade-offs guy, to come in and think about trade-offs. So we don't have to repeat all the things that we saw in the previous panels, but here's one anecdote of what happened in the panel. By me asking questions over a period of months, the committee was shut down and reformed without me. Just because I was bucking the trend, right? So of just not even bucking the trend, just asking questions in that space. So anyway, so lots of different issues happened since then. I helped advise the state of Texas, hopefully providing a path that was a little bit more sane than what we saw in the rest of the country. Thankfully, our university did not have the same stories that Arthur put forward here. We were a lot more sane than that, and that's no in a not small part, in large part, by the fact that we live in a Republican-led state that had a governor that, was not a particularly strong governor in this issue, but he has presidential ambitions. And once the DeSantis started doing what the DeSantis did, Governor Abbott said, oh, you know what, I might do some of this stuff as well. So things were a little bit better for us. So that gets me to the point where I think, I want to emphasize my discussion here, which is the fact that academia is, I don't need to repeat again the problems that we know, how broken it is, how monoculturally centric it is in terms of one set of ideas, and dissenting becomes very, very hard. But academia is 75% funded by the government, 75%. If you adjust that on a student basis, it's even larger, in the sense that we have this power law of very fancy places like Chicago spending lots of money per student, right? So if you distribute per students, there's actually a lot more are in the public space. So it's a public sector problem. We need to fix it through the public sector. And to fix it through the public sector means that we need to go and work with legislatures. And we have to work very closely, like academics that are here in these rooms have to be willing to go in the dirty business of politics, which is not fun, it's just not academically, interesting. And engage in that, because that's going to be necessary for us to recapture some of these dollars in ways that can fund institutions that function in the ways with which they are to function. So I have some hope seeing what happened in Florida in this legislative session. It's not perfect by any means what's going on there, but I think we see some spurs of okay, somebody's paying attention. Perhaps the southeast of the country will be a place where we're going to start seeing new universities coming up and new ideas put forward as our institutions are created.
Thank you, Carlos. I'd now like to introduce the Professor Emeritus of Georgetown University for some remarks.
Great. Well, I don't know how much I can speak to COVID's failures, academia's failures regarding COVID, because for most of my, as one federal judge put it, short but notable career at Georgetown, I wasn't allowed on campus because that was considered unsafe during the investigation into whether my tweet violated this or that policy. So I never got the keys to the faculty lounge or learned all, what was exactly wrong or not. I mean, it might have been a blessing in disguise in the context of COVID, because Georgetown had some of the most severe restrictions and regulations. And in fact, during the 2 meetings I had with the dean throughout the imbroglio, they were both on Zoom. I said, I would prefer to do it in person. Like, it's just more of a, human sort of thing. And he's like, well, then we'd have to be masked. It's a mess. And like, okay, yeah, then I prefer Zoom. Anyway, I think there's a similar dynamic between academia's response to COVID and what I'm writing a book about now, Canceling Justice, the Illiberal Takeover of Legal Education, which has a focus on DEI, of course, because that's kind of the overweening monster in the room that's just come out of nowhere, really come out of 70s and 80s critical studies, postmodernism, to rear its head with America's racial reckoning starting about a decade ago. And then with the George Floyd murder really accelerating, that's when all these deans and provosts and what have you for DEI arose. But of course, I think the course of that story, and including the course of my story with Georgetown, would have gone over differently had there not been the pandemic, I think, because that addled minds, it changed the way people thought about different things. It politicized the academy in ways that are different from sort of the decades-old conservative complaints about, liberals taking over the Berkeley faculty lounge or what have you. And that's why I make the point that this is an illiberal dynamic rather than simply the latest iteration of the, creeping socialism or what have you, because it fundamentally, as we've seen in the debates over COVID, shut down the other side. Not, as we hear in the shutdowns in law schools and elsewhere, we shouldn't have to hear this because that denies, the existence of our humanity or, whatever else. Well, similarly here, those perspectives were considered, not suitable for polite company outside the Overton window. The Overton windows of all sorts have been warped and shifted during this time. There was a COVID example at Georgetown about concomitant with my unrelated experience. William Spruance was a 2L, and he was suspended, investigated, referred to mental health investigators for questioning certain university policies at a public meeting. He somehow was, got out of it and graduated and is working in big law in Skadden and still manages to write op-eds. Well, I told him, I had lunch with him a few months ago. I said, this will probably not last long for you, so I hope you're thinking about long-term plans. By the way, I might hire him. Who knows? I just hired to work for me. Very excited about this. The president of the Federal Society chapter at Stanford Law School, who made the rounds of media after the shutdown of the federal judge there. But anyway, my experience during COVID has mostly been on Twitter, a little bit of op-ed writing, and litigation. Actually, I filed briefs and even appeared in federal court, both virtually and in person, in the District of Puerto Rico, challenging their draconian COVID orders, which were worse, believe it or not, than any other U.S. jurisdiction. So my conclusion from all of this experience is simply that the freedom, the academic freedom, the free speech, the spirit of inquiry that I encountered when I was a college student at Princeton in the late 90s, and then in law school right here at the University of Chicago in the early 2000s, it's very different now. COVID changed, accelerated certain trends in that direction. And again, I don't have as much of an insider's perspective because the entire, basically most of the time when I was not suspended at Georgetown, I was writing a resignation letter. But in any event, just lots of warping. And this is supposed to be a forward-looking panel, and we can get into that. And I hope we will, because I do have some. It's not just a mutual therapy session or complaint session. I think there are things that can and should be done. But this experience really exposed weaknesses, foundational weaknesses in important American institutions.
Thank you very much. Now, Todd.
Well, I guess I'm redundant in my title, but I guess I'm also redundantly relevant to this panel because, as you heard earlier, I sued my university over their COVID vaccine mandate because I had natural immunity. But I may also, as far as I know, I'm the only person I know of who is personally responsible for getting speech codes repealed at two different universities, both when I ran for the Board of Trustees at Dartmouth 15 years ago, and then came back to George Mason and agitated to get our speech code repealed at George Mason. And I'll add one last thing is I would commend those who are interested in this. We adopted, that I helped author a free speech policy at the law school at George Mason, the Statement on Faculty Dialogue and Debate. And like everything else with George Mason, we took Chicago's ideas and made them better. So I love your free speech policy. Ours is better. Our law and economics is better, and as well. And everything I'm about to say, I'm going to be brief, but I'm going to exempt my colleagues in my law school.
Is the law school better?
The law school is better too, yes. I'm going to exempt my colleagues in the law school from everything I'm about to say because I'm going to paint with a very broad, but I think fairly accurate brush as to where things are in higher education and the challenges of reforming a lot of the problems we've heard today. Here's the fundamental problem. Academia is populated by scum. Did Carvalho just spit out his water next to you? The bureaucrats are really a problem in higher education today. They have no academic values. They run huge swaths of the university. I will give you an example. Which is a few years ago, I wrote an article about my efforts to repeal George Mason's speech code rescinded. And I noted at the end of that, this was soon after Chicago in the Stone report wrote this wonderful report that we've all heard about, Free Speech of Chicago. I went over to the FIRE website. Chicago had a yellow light rating. for free speech, unbeknownst to chair of the committee, Jeff Stone, because some bureaucrat somewhere in the Chicago administration had promulgated some restrictions on speech, right? Speech codes are not promulgated by faculty. They're promulgated by bureaucrats deep in the bowels of the university who police them like petty tyrants, do not have academic values, and they're basically concerned about holding students' hands and that sort of thing. And the relevance of this became quite clear to me during the COVID battle, which is when I was thinking about, the first thing I did, obviously, was when they talked, I got COVID right off the bat. Like, I got COVID the first week of March 2020. I was at a conference, the first time I ever met Scott Atlas. I was at a conference in New York City, hung around Penn Station for a few hours waiting for an Acela. COVID was probably about the 5th most dangerous thing I was exposed to, hanging out in Penn Station for a couple hours. But I went home and had something that I had never had before. Couldn't get a test at the time, obviously, because we were tested. And figured out later that I had COVID, right? So I got an antibodies test. I volunteered to teach in person that fall. We wanted to reopen our law school that fall. Reopen law school. I volunteered to teach in person. I was in my 50s, right? A lot of people went off and, went to their beach houses and, all that sort of stuff. But I thought, hey, everybody tells me I'm safe, right? Anthony Fauci said 2 weeks into the pandemic, if you've got COVID, you're safe from getting COVID. I was like, all right, I got COVID. I'm going to do my job as a law professor, right? Which it didn't seem to me 3 hours a week of work didn't seem like that backbreaking of a responsibility to go into the classroom. Well, it came around to the next year, and George Mason's promulgating its COVID policy. And so I said, well, obviously you guys are going to exempt people with natural immunity, right? This was right after the vaccines had come out. And they wrote back some garbage reports, right? Well, this study and that study, that sort of thing. So the next time I wrote them back, I had my lawyer write them back and said, no, I really think you should think about exempting natural immunity. But here's kind of gives you the absurdity of how these places are run these days, which is, on my side, I had my expert witnesses. I had Jay Bhattacharya, Martin Koldorf, and my personal immunologist who had a PhD in immunology and has taught at Harvard and at Penn Law School. Our policy at George Mason was designed by the fire chief of the university. And that's who was sending me these emails about this study and that study as to things, right? Literally, the fire chief designed our policy at George Mason. And basically said, this is our policy and that sort of thing. And what soon became evident, and what is a general problem in higher education today, and I think a general problem in society today, is nobody takes responsibility for anything. Nobody takes personal responsibility for anything. And nobody will put their name on these speech codes. Nobody would take responsibility for COVID policies. Well, the CDC says that. Well, who is the CDC? Well, the CDC, right? We're just following the guidance. Well, the CDC says, well, it's just guidance. It's not binding on anybody, right? Basically, nobody will take responsibility for anything. Here's the questions that needed to be asked of the university administrators, right? Of the presidents and boards of trustees. How many cases of myocarditis are appropriate collateral damage to make healthy 19-year-old boys get a COVID vaccine they don't need? 5, 10, 12? How many trips to the emergency room from people getting a shot they don't need are appropriate? How much of an increased risk? Because every study that's been done of people who had COVID and got the vaccine show a highly elevated risk of adverse events from this, right? Give me a number. Somebody somewhere needs to take responsibility for those decisions. And nobody has taken any responsibility for anything that they've done. Corporate officials haven't done it. They all shunt it off to some mid-level bureaucrat, right? The fire chief of the university who says, well, I'm not the expert. I'm just deferring to the CDC, right? Like the CDC knows anything about my personal health history, right? The last thing I'll say about this, we've heard about this a lot, is I learned a new term during this thing. There's misinformation, disinformation, and something called malinformation. Malinformation, it turns out, is information that is true, but somebody somewhere thinks people shouldn't know it, right? So that's why they just said they needed to suppress on Twitter true information about the vaccines, because that could create vaccine hesitancy because it was true. That's what you call malinformation. And that's what we're seeing now in the universities, is where they don't care about error, right? Error can be refuted by the traditional methods of reason, logic, and scientific method. What they care about is truth. They care about truths that are politically inconvenient, right? They go against the narrative. That's what they're going after today. We can think about all the topics in which truth must be suppressed, not because it's true, not because it's false, precisely because it's true, and it could be used in their terms to be weaponized for some political agenda. It all comes back to politics. I'll close with one last thought. My friend Steve Pejovich, great free market economist, died a year or two ago. He grew up in Yugoslavia. He lived under the Nazis and the communists. And I asked him I asked him, what's the difference between the Nazis and the communists? He said, the Nazis wanted your obedience. The communists want your heart and your mind, right? The Nazis wanted you to salute when they said salute, right? The communists want you to salute voluntarily and force other people to do it, right? To internalize what they're saying. That's what the war of information is about. That's what the war on so-called disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation is about, is getting our students, getting our young people to internalize these beliefs about what is acceptable, what is unacceptable, based on politics, not on truth.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with a question. First of all, I want to apologize for my own misinformation. I think I said catch 21 is catch 22. And for that, I will disqualify myself from further comments. No, I actually, the interesting thing with malinformation is I just testified in Congress a few days ago on Homeland Security censorship of social media, including malinformation, which is, as Todd's noted, is actually based on true information that they believe is, quote, misleading or corrupting people. And what's fascinating about that effort of the Homeland Security is that it was based on an announcement that they, and this was by this small agency that's supposed to deal with infrastructure in the United States. And the head of that agency declared that she believed that they had to go further from bridges and highways and to go into regulating, quote, cognitive infrastructure, and announced that Homeland Security, through her agency, would now be regulating cognitive infrastructure to deal with MDM. And I just can't imagine anything more Orwellian. But I want to throw out a question about, as we look sort of in the future, it's going to have two components, and you can choose what you would like. Yeah, I've written in the past that in the free speech community, we may have to begin to view public universities as our final line of defense. That with public universities, you have the benefit of the First Amendment, so you have someone to sue, you've got standing to sue, and you've got a case law to use. It's just so much more difficult with private universities. So I've got sort of a two-pronged question for people on the panel. First of all, with public universities, you have like Florida moving to actually remove funding from universities. And that has been challenged by fellow academics, saying that's a deprivation of academic freedom. And I have to say, it makes me uncomfortable. I don't like have legislators telling us what you can teach in universities. That just hits me wrong. I understand where they're coming from, because it's not going to change. At places like Harvard, the Harvard Crimson did an article where they actually tracked down one of the last remaining members of the Harvard faculty who was a registered Republican. He was 90 years old, I believe, in the math department, and the Crimson interviewed him like he was this white buffalo on the plains. And they basically sort of poked him to sort of say, this is what a Republican looks like. But my favorite thing about that piece is they said, but don't worry, it's okay. We don't need Republicans because that's not the point of academia. So you're going to have this continuing trend, right, where Republicans, libertarians are basically purged from schools. So the question is it a violation of academic freedom? How do we thread that needle? On the public side, and then on the private side, how do we deal with the fact that we don't have a First Amendment? We're left with sort of contractual claims. The interesting is each of you have actually been in the trenches on one or both of those questions. So.
Right. Let me just Hello. Yeah. First, there's a colleague of mine that has a lawsuit against our university right now on First Amendment rights that claim has been violated. So that's something that I encourage you to take a look at a lawsuit, because hopefully there'll be some law actually comes out of that, not just the adjudication of that case. And yeah, you're right. We have this extra protection, which is great in public universities, but the notion that the state does not have a role in dictating what's taught, I disagree tremendously. I'm a statistician. When I'm given the role to go in my classroom, teach a class in statistics, I'm told to teach statistics. That I have no freedom to not teach statistics in that class. And yet what happens is that we hire people, quote, historians or philosophers or whatever, that got given the mandate to teach history, for example, and they don't teach history, they teach something else. And I think the state has a role to say, wait a second, that's not what you're hired for. We're gonna change. We're gonna put some more clear guardrails here in dictating what you teach. So I think that there needs to be a separation between your First Amendment when it comes to your Twitter profile, whatever you write in your scholarly articles. Sure, I don't want the government regulating that in any way, shape, or form. But when it comes to the passing of knowledge, given how crazy it has, the direction in which things have gone in academia, especially in the humanities, I see a necessity for the government to intervene and say, I'm paying billions of dollars to this aggregate over the states that are majority Republican in the country. And this is not actually, this is something completely outside of what we want our students to be getting. And I think that we're going to need to be more comfortable with the notion of putting our fingers more deeply in the business of academics in order to fix this problem. We need to change the incentive structure they have. And that's the one big way that we can do it, is through the financing of it, like Florida is doing, and through the government, the legislative process, putting better guardrails in place.
Well, I'm a little nervous about state legislators dictating what shall and shall not be taught, micromanaging syllabi, course catalogs, and the rest of it. But somebody needs to make those decisions, right? Whether it's university presidents, trustees, department chairs, there's different levels of decision making that, some university might want to be a STEM university, and so they close their English department because it's, redundant and they can't be, one of the best, so better focus on something other. Different decision. And, I'm sympathetic to the idea that a state legislator wouldn't want taxpayer dollars going towards a class on Marxist-oriented social justice activism or something like that. So anyway, there are nuances in all this, but stepping back, you have to differentiate among the various issues that you raised, Jonathan. So there's one thing about freedom of speech, academic freedom within the classroom. There's one about which courses are taught, which departments do we have, that sort of thing. And then there's funding of bureaucracies. And on this latter point, and this goes to what Todd has said, again, not DEI bureaucracies, what I've been focusing on the last number of months, but bureaucracies more generally. Around 2010 or so was the tipping point where at most universities there started to be more non-teaching staff than full-time faculty. That's before the DEI explosion. Now we think of the growth in bureaucracy is largely DEI, which it is. But even then, when schools started competing on who has better climbing walls and gyms and lazy rivers and mental health advisories and hand-holding professionals and all the rest of it, I read a fun op-ed that at Yale there are now more bureaucrats or educrats than students. And so perhaps Yale should go back to like it was 150 years ago, where every student had his own personal butler, this time provided by the administration, right? But to the extent that I'm sure a lot of the COVID inanity was driven to, not by the faculty, I think getting rid of these budgets, these structures, these bureaucracies would go a long way towards preventing that. Now, again, Todd and Carlos could speak better to how COVID policy would have been run in academia if it was all voted by faculty senates and so forth, rather than the deputy assistant provost for fire captaining or whatever. But I think at least that would have been made more sense in the terms of the traditional conception of university governance.
So the logic of academic freedom rests in the idea that we are like a profession, and that we can be self-governing. At one point we make in our faculty statement of classroom dialogue and debate at Scalia is the classroom is and should be a unequal relationship. The professor is in charge of the classroom. The professor picks the syllabus. The professor assigns the curriculum. That's because we're the professor, right? It is a learned profession, and we defer to experts and professionals when we exercise our responsibilities in the right way. So we also say the flip side of that is the professor also has the obligation not to abuse that inherently hierarchical and unequal relationship in the classroom. You do not talk about things that are not part of the class. You do not pick on students. You do not exert ideological influence, that sort of thing. What we are seeing is universities have stopped they are no longer self-governing. The universities are no longer exercising that fiduciary duty, that moral responsibility in a responsible way. And so the question becomes, what do we do about it? And I think that at that point, if universities aren't going to govern themselves appropriately, it's appropriate to put them in receivership in some way, whether it's through public universities or whether it's through private actions, whether it's something like we have like the Solomon Amendment, which requires every university to allow the military on campus to interview students if they want to get federal tax dollars. I have no problem with something like that when universities have shown that they're going to discriminate against the military again and again and again. And so I think that's the question we have to ask ourselves: is universities aren't going to fix their own house. Yeah, it makes me queasy to talk about academic freedom. It makes me queasy to talk about infringing on the self-governing aspects of universities. But if universities aren't going to govern themselves, somebody has to.
And one other thing that brings to mind is about 6 weeks or so, the end of March, I testified before the House Education Committee about issues with speech on campus. And one thing I suggested there, and that they're considering, is strings attached to federal funding, because of course, as Carlos said, private institutions get plenty of federal funding as well, and there are already plenty of strings attached to that. You have to certify that you follow certain accounting methods, that you don't discriminate in certain ways. Well, you could add to that, and we follow First Amendment principles, and we have due process for accusation, whatever kind of, riders, strings of that sort you want to attach. Congress is certainly, I think that most federal funding of education is unconstitutional, but setting that aside, if you're going to have it, you can certainly attach those kinds of strings.
All right, let's open it up for questions from the group. Yes.
It seems to me that if we look at the last 30 or 40 years, so I went to the business school here, and there were antitrust laws in place. You had Glass-Steagall. You had all of these mechanisms to ensure that we had a certain degree of competition and decentralization. And what's happened in the last 30 years, there's the huge M&A takeover boom in the late 80s and 90s. What we've seen, you had the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine in 1988, which enabled 5 or 6 giant multinational corporations to gobble up every single independent, or virtually every media, radio, television, local stations and all this. So it's all consolidated in the corporate hands. And then you've got this behemoth that we call the government. And you guys are talking about how we can use the government